who got the response to the pandemic very right and who got it very wrong?
Well, nobody gets an A because Taiwan got it very right now at the beginning, but has actually stumbled in the last few weeks because they got a little overconfident. The things to get right were the testing, the contact tracing, and the effective isolation of anybody infected or suspected of being infected. And Taiwan did that, and so did South Korea. And New Zealand kind of copied Taiwan, and there were a bunch of other countries that in their different ways used this playbook. And that meant that they really effectively early on got a handle on the virus and stopped it spreading. The problem is that if you did that in 2020, the incentive to get vaccination right has been much less powerful. So Taiwan has stumbled in the last few weeks because they had a kind of chink in their armor, which was that the quarantines of flight crew from international flights were not that strict. There was an outbreak in a hotel where pilots and crew were staying, and then they realized, we've not vaccinated anybody. I mean, they barely vaccinated anybody at all.
Yeah.
And also, we don't have the testing capacity because we've kind of taken our eye off the ball. And I interviewed Audrey Tang, the digital minister in Taiwan, who's really one of the heroes of my story, last week, and said, are you victims of your own success? And she said, yeah, because we just didn't emphasize vaccination because we thought we had this done. So nobody's really aced this. Many countries that did shockingly badly last year, like the UK, did really well with vaccination. The US has done pretty well with vaccination. And so there's a kind of strange inversion here. If you really screwed up last year, your incentive to get vaccination right was really, really big. If you nailed it last year, it was like, we don't need vaccination. Actually, everybody needs vaccination because the virus is a shapeshifter and it's going to find a way through even the Taiwanese armor. I do think that there's a general lesson that hasn't been fully learned, particularly because of the way the media have covered the crisis. The general lesson is that in a disaster, whether it's a public health disaster or some other kind, it's not necessarily the prime minister or the president who is the key figure. Ultimately, the buck stops with the man or woman at the top. But I think we attribute too much importance to those individuals. Of course, they want us to. Both Boris Johnson and Donald Trump wanted to be centers of attention, and Dominic Cummings made that point today. But in truth, when you're dealing with a new coronavirus, it's not really the prime minister's job to sit and read the latest reports from China and figure out the dispersion factor and the appropriate mitigation measures. He has people whose job that is. And in both the US and the UK and many European countries too, the officials whose job was public health and pandemic preparedness have performed very poorly. And there's no getting away from that. I have respect for the epidemiologists, including the other Niall Ferguson, but you have to ask what on earth they were doing in January and February and early March. It was obvious to me, and I'm just a historian, that there was a pandemic underway by about the second or third week of January. And that the rational thing at that point was as far as possible to limit travel from China, and then as far as possible to find out who in the country already had the disease. And I found myself in Washington in mid-February, and there was still a general air of denial at that point. And by that time, it was too late. The virus was probably already in every state, and it was similar in the UK. So we have to ask ourselves, why the experts, the public health bureaucrats, whose one job this is, were apparently asleep at the wheel? And it's even more mystifying, and this is a really important point the book makes, because on paper they were prepared. There were pandemic preparedness plans. And in 2019, a major global survey, which was published by the Economist Intelligence Unit, said the best prepared countries for a public health emergency in the world are the United States, number one, the United Kingdom, number two. Now, that turned out to be about as wrong as it gets, because if there's one league table we at least came close to leading at the worst of the pandemic, it was the countries with the highest excess mortality. And we've been beaten out to the sort of top spots by some really disastrous cases like Peru and Ecuador. But in the end, those that were expected to do really well did really badly. And we need to understand why that was. Because if we just tell ourselves, and I hear this a lot, Boris is an idiot, that's why it happened. Trump was a moron, that's why we had excess mortality. If we tell ourselves that all you have to do is switch the person at the top, if we tell ourselves the story that, oh, if only Joe Biden had got the job a year early, we wouldn't have had excess mortality. If only Corbyn had been prime minister, we wouldn't have had excess mortality. If you believe those fairy stories, you aren't learning the right lesson, because the true point of failure was not at the top. Those guys screwed up in all kinds of ways, no question. Trump in particular, multiple mistakes. But those were not the mistakes that really explain the excess mortality. The mistakes were made at the level of the public health bureaucrats. They screwed up testing. They didn't even try contact tracing in the US. The UK finally got around to that. And at no point have we been effective at isolating infected people. We still aren't, because we don't really take seriously some of the very basic rules of plague management, which we've actually known since the Middle Ages. And the kind of rule number one, even if you don't understand the first thing about why you're having the bubonic plague, is you do try to stop people who might have the disease from just kind of coming to your town. We've forgotten that most elementary rule of plague control.